He taught Alexander the Great how to conquer the world. But his most powerful lesson was about conquering your own mind. Around 340 BC in ancient Greece, Aristotle became tutor to a 13-year-old prince named Alexander. Everyone expected him to teach military strategy, battle tactics, politics, but Aristotle taught something more fundamental: how to think clearly, how to analyze situations logically, how to separate truth from opinion, how to make decisions based on reason instead of emotion. And that training, that discipline of clear thinking, helped Alexander conquer more territory than anyone in history. Not because he was the strongest, because he thought more clearly than everyone else. And Aristotle spent his life developing a method anyone can use. A way to train your mind to cut through confusion, emotion, and bias. To see what's actually true. To think like a philosopher even if you're not one. Here's the problem with how most people think. They don't actually think. They react. They feel something and assume that feeling is truth. They hear something that confirms what they already believe and accept it without question. They make decisions based on emotion, then justify them with whatever reasoning sounds good. And they wonder why they keep making mistakes. Why their judgments are wrong. Why they can't see situations clearly. It's because they never learned how to actually think. Aristotle watched this constantly. People with strong opinions about things they didn't understand. People making decisions without examining the facts. People being swayed by clever words instead of sound arguments. People confusing what they want to be true with what actually is true. And he saw that this fuzzy thinking led to bad decisions. Bad decisions led to bad outcomes. And bad outcomes led to suffering. So he developed a system, a method for thinking clearly, for analyzing arguments, for finding truth, for making sound judgments. And it's not complicated philosophy. It's practical tools anyone can use. But most people never learn them. So they go through life thinking poorly, and paying the price for it. First principle: define your terms. Aristotle taught that most confusion comes from using words without understanding what they mean. Someone says they want justice. But what is justice? Someone claims something is good. But what do you mean by good? If you can't define your terms clearly, you can't think clearly. He'd watch people argue for hours without realizing they were using the same words to mean different things. No wonder they couldn't agree. They weren't even talking about the same thing. But neither stopped to define what they meant. They just kept talking past each other. So Aristotle made it simple. Before you argue a position, define your terms. What exactly do you mean by the words you're using? And if you're listening to someone else, make them define their terms. Don't let vague language hide unclear thinking. Second principle: identify your assumptions. Every argument rests on assumptions. Things you're taking as true without proving them. And if your assumptions are wrong, your conclusion will be wrong, no matter how good your logic is. Most people never examine their assumptions. They just build arguments on top of beliefs they never questioned. Aristotle taught that you have to dig down to the foundation. What are you assuming is true? Why do you believe that? What evidence supports it? If you can't justify your assumptions, your whole argument collapses. But most people defend their conclusions without ever examining the assumptions underneath. That's not thinking clearly. That's building on sand. Third principle: follow the logic. Aristotle basically invented formal logic, the study of how conclusions follow from premises. If A is true, and B follows from A, then B is true. Simple, but most people violate this constantly. They jump from premise to conclusion without a logical connection. They assume things are related when they're not. They confuse correlation with causation. They make leaps that don't follow. He taught that you have to check every step. Does this conclusion actually follow from these premises? Or am I assuming a connection that isn't there? Most arguments fall apart when you examine them this closely, because the logic doesn't hold. But people defend them anyway because they want the conclusion to be true. Fourth principle: consider alternatives. Aristotle was obsessed with this. He'd present an argument, then systematically consider every possible objection, every alternative explanation, every way it could be wrong, not to undermine the argument, to strengthen it. If your position can't withstand scrutiny, it's not a good position. But most people do the opposite. They find one explanation that makes sense to them and stop looking. They ignore alternatives, dismiss objections, refuse to consider that they might be wrong, and that closed-mindedness guarantees fuzzy thinking. Because you're not actually seeking truth. You're defending a belief you already have. Aristotle trained his students to argue against their own positions, to find the strongest possible objection, to consider the best alternative. And only if their original position survived that test was it worth holding. That's intellectual honesty. That's thinking clearly. Fifth principle: distinguish fact from opinion. Aristotle was clear about this. A fact is something you can verify. Something that's true regardless of what anyone thinks. An opinion is a judgment, a preference. Something that might be reasonable but isn't objectively true. Most people confuse these constantly. They state opinions as if they're facts, and they reject facts because they don't like them. He taught that you have to separate these. What can you prove? What's just your interpretation? What's objective reality versus your subjective experience of it? If you can't make these distinctions, you can't think clearly about anything. There's this famous example from Aristotle's teaching. Someone would claim all swans are white, because every swan they'd seen was white. Aristotle would ask, "Have you seen every swan?" "No." "Then you can't claim all swans are white. You can say all the swans you've seen were white. That's a fact. But claiming all swans are white is an assumption that might be false. And it is. Black swans exist. That distinction matters, because most of what people believe confidently is based on limited observation treated as universal truth. They extrapolate from their experience to all experience. And that creates false certainty, which leads to bad thinking and bad decisions. Now let's make this practical, because you're probably thinking poorly right now about multiple things, and it's costing you in your decisions, your relationships, your understanding of the world. But you can fix it by applying Aristotle's method. Pick a belief you hold strongly, something you're certain about. Now apply the method. First, define your terms. What exactly do you mean by the words you're using? Can you state your belief with precise language? Most people can't. Their thinking is vague, and vague thinking produces vague results. Second, identify your assumptions. What are you taking as true without proving? What foundation is your belief built on? Dig down until you hit something you can actually verify. You might find your whole belief rests on assumptions you never examined, and maybe they're wrong. Third, check the logic. Does your conclusion actually follow from your premises, or are you making leaps? Are you assuming connections that aren't there? Most beliefs fall apart here, because the logic doesn't hold. People just want it to be true, so they don't check if the reasoning is sound. Fourth, consider alternatives. What's the strongest argument against your position? What's the best alternative explanation? Can you steel-man the other side instead of straw-manning it? If your belief can't survive considering alternatives, it's probably not a good belief. Fifth, separate fact from opinion. What can you actually prove? What's just your interpretation? What's objective versus subjective? This distinction alone would save most people from most of their confused thinking. Here's what happens when you do this consistently. You become harder to manipulate. Because you can spot bad arguments. You can see when someone's using vague language to hide weak thinking. You can identify false assumptions. You can catch logical fallacies. You can distinguish fact from opinion. And that makes you dangerous to anyone who profits from people thinking poorly. Aristotle taught Alexander this method. And Alexander used it to analyze every situation he faced. Every opponent, every decision. He didn't just react emotionally. He thought clearly, examined assumptions, considered alternatives, made logical decisions based on facts. And that clarity gave him an enormous advantage over everyone else who was thinking poorly. You're not conquering empires, but you face decisions every day. And those decisions determine your life, your career, your relationships, your future. And if you're making them based on fuzzy thinking, based on unexamined assumptions, based on emotion disguised as logic, you're going to make bad decisions and suffer the consequences. But if you train yourself to think clearly using Aristotle's method, everything changes. You make better decisions. You see through manipulation. You understand situations more deeply. You waste less time on bad ideas. You build on solid foundations instead of shaky assumptions. That's power. Real power. The power of a trained mind. Most people never develop this. They go through life thinking whatever feels right, whatever confirms their bias, whatever's convenient to believe, and they wonder why nothing works out, why they keep making the same mistakes, why they can't see clearly. It's because they never learned to think clearly, never trained their mind, never developed the discipline of logical analysis. Aristotle gave you the method 2,000 years ago, and it still works. Better than ever, actually. Because in an age of information overload, clear thinking is rarer and more valuable than ever. Everyone has opinions. Almost nobody has clear thought. Be the exception. The art of thinking clearly isn't natural. It's trained. Through practice, through discipline, through applying these principles until they become automatic. And once you have that skill, you have something nobody can take from you. A mind that cuts through confusion, that sees truth, that makes sound judgments. That's what Aristotle taught Alexander. And that's what's changed history. Subscribe for more wisdom that sharpens your mind.